Good evening, everyone. Welcome to this fourth Corona Café. Hope you're all well settled with a warm drink. The Corona Cafés are a partnership between the Alliance Française, the Elephant, and the French Institute for Research in Africa. The idea behind the cafés is to engage in conversations with experts and intellectuals as we reimagine the society in the context of the pandemic and after, in order to spark a better future. We hope it will encourage rethinking many prior assumptions and finding new balances for individual and collective engagement. The first three cafés invited us to reimagine better healthcare systems, eradicating the plague of social inequalities, and reforming education. This one will reimagine a new model of society. So may I please invite our moderator, Dr. Mishai Mangola, to begin the conversations with our distinguished panel of experts. Thank you. Mishai, welcome.
Thank you very much, Asita. It's such a joy to be here for the fourth Corona Café. I want to thank everybody who is joining us again, especially for those of you who've been with us through several of the other cafes, and also anybody who's joining us for the first time. We have such an exciting panel to close out this series of 4 cafes. And before we get to them, I just want to thank everybody who's brought us here again, our hosts, the Elephant, the French Institute for Research in Africa, IFRA Nairobi, and the Alliance Française who are hosting us. And I want to do a special shout out. For those of you who've been following us, you know that we have had 4 amazing posters for each of these sessions. And I just want to thank Gado for very generously giving us his thought-provoking illustrations on what Corona is doing to us in Kenya and to us in Africa, and that have been the springboard for the conversations that we are having. So thank you very much to all of you. So we have been thinking about not only what this crisis is doing to us today, but in a world shaped by international movements, neoliberalism, with everything that we've been facing as a country and as a continent, we thought that we'd take a moment to stop and reflect on if this moment could be a positive time for all of us, a time for us to just stop, to reflect, and maybe it would turn into a turning point in the history of the world, in the history of Africa, and in the history of each of the countries. Especially, we've been thinking about Kenya. But today we thought we would open it up and ask ourselves, could this be a space for fostering social progress, not just here in Kenya, but for the whole continent? As Atsita has mentioned, we've had 3 cafes in the last 2 months, and they have revealed some strengths among us, but also weaknesses. They've helped us think through our preparedness to deal not only with this disease, but to think through the fault lines within our communities, within the country, within the continent, and within this world that are holding us back from the people and the world that we dream we could become. So our focus today will not be so much on the pandemic and what is happening and what has happened, but really in thinking through how we can make a new world from where we are today. As we mentioned, the first 3 panel discussions dealt on health, social inequality, and education. And here's what we came up with together with the amazing 7 panelists that we have had so far. Number 1, we are clear the world cannot continue as it is. Secondly, we are convinced that there needs to be a grounds-up transformation and revolution. And one of the big surprises for me is that all our previous panelists have emphasized that we can start right here in our communities, that even as we begin to think about the big picture, we need to start small. Now, even though we emphasized a lot in Kenya and in the small picture, we also paid attention to the way that we are part of a big world, a big global world. And we began to think about how the hierarchical order that currently exists is dying, if it's not already dead. And that if we want to think towards the future, if we want to see what we would become in 2015 and influence what the world would be like, we needed a vision today to inspire us through those next few decades. And at the heart of all our discussions, somewhere the elephant in the room, so to speak, was the question of economics. Whether we were talking about the question of resources, how we were going to make the things we wanted to do possible, whether we were talking about the things that stop us from getting there. And of course, in this COVID season, what was always at the back of our minds is that we seem to be stuck in this dilemma. Do we pay attention to health first, or do we look at the economy first? So this dilemma is what has brought us to this conversation. So we're going to begin with a conversation amongst ourselves for maybe about an hour, and then we will go to questions and answers from those of you who have joined us right here in the webinar room. Let me encourage you, we will come to your questions, and let me encourage you to use the question and answer chat over there so that it's easy for us to pick out the questions. But if you have thoughts, if you have things you want to share with all of us, please put them on the chat and we'll continue to have a vibrant discussion. And when it gets to about 8 o'clock, I'll make sure that we have some time for you to engage these panelists. I'm going to go straight on and introduce the amazing panel that has joined us. And I'm so grateful to each one of the three thinkers, the three public intellectuals who have come with us today. I'll start by introducing Crystal Simeone. Crystal comes to us from the world of policy, but very importantly, and this is why I wanted to start with Crystal, Crystal is very committed to citizen action, citizens having their voice heard, and citizens being the drivers of policy, of the decision-making that's happening at all levels. She has worked extensively at the subnational and national levels here in Kenya, but has also been involved on the regional and continental levels, starting out in civil society organizations like Inuka and Hivos Kenya, before becoming the policy lead for the thematic area on international finance architecture at the Tax Justice Network Africa. So I know we'll be talking about taxes. So those of you who haven't paid your taxes, ooh, Crystal's coming for you. And then most recently, she was head of advocacy and lead on economic justice issues at Femnet, and so has worked on these issues all across the continent. And Crystal has just stepped down from that position to set up NAWI, the Afrofam Macroeconomics Collective. Crystal, you're so welcome. And let me just start by asking you, what is an Afrofam Macroeconomics Collective? Like, what does that mean? Karibu, Crystal.
Do you want me to answer that now?
Yes, I do want you to answer that.
Okay, so Afrofam is, as you can imagine, African feminists working on macroeconomics, and we're building a collective around this body of work. NAWI is the name of the last known survivor of the Dahomey Amazonians, who were the first documented all-women elite fighting force in present-day Benin. And they fought a very hard fight against colonial French rule. And so it's an ode to them, and in remembering and keeping their memory alive, and remembering NAWI, who was the last known survivor, as I said. So it's bringing back everything, but also sometimes the work around macroeconomic policy feels like a battlefield, and so it's also an ode to that.
So you're going to be leading us into the battle as a continent. So I really look forward to hearing what you have to say. We're also joined by our brother Grieve. Grieve is coming to us all the way from South Africa. Grieve Chelwa, let me first say, once worked for a bank in Nairobi, and I'm sure that's where he got all the amazing wisdom that he's going to share with us. But having been a banker, Grieve then went into the academy. He has studied at the University of Zambia and the University of Cape Town, has been a postgrad fellow at the University of Wits as well as Harvard, and is currently at UCT as a senior lecturer in the School of Business. Grieve's work is absolutely fascinating. He has researched and taught on the economics of health and education. So some of the conversations that we've been having in previous Corona Cafes, I'm sure we will reiterate some of those things today. And I'm completely fascinated with his work on development economics, especially his focus on the epistemological foundations of development economics. Grieve, what does that mean? You're very welcome, by the way.
Mishai, thanks so much. It's an honor to be part of this panel and part of this important conversation. I'm also very humbled to be on the same panel with Crystal and Professor Zeleza, whom I've learned a lot from. His copious body of work is one that has taught us a lot, and I'm honored to be part of this panel. You've asked the hardest question, Mishai. I wasn't ready for that question, but it's basically just interrogating what the assumptions of the field known as development economics is. I think for the lay person, who's not sort of a specialist in economics or in development economics, when you hear the word development economics, or they sort of two words together, we have an idea. You sort of think, oh, this is dealing with big issues about what development is about. If I ask my grandmother in the village, I'm a development economist, she has an idea about, are these people bringing roads, water, industrialization? But the way development economics is practiced today is totally different. So what I try to do in that project is basically to interrogate these sort of assumptions about what development is as conceived by development economists. So in a nutshell, that's exactly what it's about.
The reason I ask that question is I think one of the issues that we are always dealing with is when we talk about the economy and the economy is collapsing in this COVID crisis, we are thinking of it in relation to what will the implications be for our development. Yeah, given our, those 2050, 2030, 2063 visions that we have at the back of our minds, which we'll come back to in the conversation. So Karibu Sana Grief, welcome home. And I hope that you will soon make that a physical coming into Kenya. And last but certainly not least, we thought we'd bring a historian into the conversation. Professor Paul Zeleza probably needs no introduction to many of you. He's one of this continent's foremost public intellectuals, having written extensively on many aspects of history. Perhaps for this conversation, for the purpose of this conversation, Prof is probably best known for a book, A Modern Economic History of Africa, that he wrote that continues to inform much of our understanding and thinking of what, for many of us, for me, I'm going to be very honest, that was my introduction to the idea of an economic history and to understanding how we got in terms of the economy to where we are from where we came from. Prof has taught extensively in the US. He's headed many programs, many departments, many faculties. If I read them through, that would be probably most of the panel, before becoming VP academic at Quinnipiac University. And finally, and I'm saying this with such joy, coming home to us. He's based in Nairobi, where he heads USIU Africa as Vice Chancellor. He has an extensive research portfolio, as I mentioned. Not only has he written about the economic history of Africa, he's dealt with education in Africa. He's looked at the question of the African crises and questions of globalization. A bit like Grieve, he's talked about this African studies and how we manufacture African studies and understanding the crises and the things that they deal with. There are many things I could say about Prof. I think for me, the most important is that he is an honorary Kenyan. Don't believe him when he says he has citizenship of anywhere else. Not only does he live here now, but he taught quite a while at KU. In fact, I believe, Prof, your dissertation was on Kenya. So I want to welcome you, but also just ask you to say, when we talk of economic history, for the layperson, what are you talking about? How is that different from our political history? Karibu, Prof. Hello, Prof.
I think Prof is muted.
Prof, I think you may be muted. We're not being able to hear you.
Hello, can you hear me?
Hello. Okay.
Yes.
I think while we there you go.
Yeah, I was saying thank you very much for the opportunity to have this conversation with my two colleagues, Chelwa and Simeone. Economic history is really about trying to find out how economic systems have evolved over time. And in my own work, I was interested in a number of things. First of all, how do we understand economic changes? which of course leads to questions of epistemology and analytical frames and so on. And specifically, how do production systems change over time? Agriculture, manufacturing, you name it, but also very critical are social relations in the production process. How do these change over time? And I was also interested, obviously, in relations between Africa and the rest of the world, because, of course, our economic history is tied not only to internal dynamics, but also external engagements.
Oh, thank you very much, Prof. And I wanted us to start there because I think one of the things that everybody kept saying we didn't get time to have enough of, so I want to make sure we have enough time this time, is to think about the past and to think about, well, when we think about COVID, there's certain things that come to our mind and we say, we are beginning to see very clearly certain things about our economy. So I'm going to ask each of you, let's just start the conversation first by saying, what for you is the most glaring lesson that this COVID season has taught us about our economy? And then we're going to take a step back and to ask, how did we get there? What's our history? What's our background in terms of this? So, Crystal, what for you, when you talk about COVID and we talk about the economy and we talk about this area of economics, what for you is the most glaring characteristic, the thing that just jumps out to you?
Sorry, I was on mute. So working in the area of feminist economics, but also doing so with a Pan-African lens, it's really interesting to see all the things that we've been saying, but also that we've been saying and generations before me have been saying for so many years. I stumbled on a book by Dawn, which is a development alternatives for women in a new era, written and published in 1985. I was almost not here, but it was really interesting to hear that they were talking about the exact same things that I talk about now. And so for many people who've been in the space, I'm sure they must be so bored with neoliberalism, with the way the world is organized, with the economic structures as organized today. I've been saying Jason Hickel, an academic, says, the global architecture and governance system, there's almost like there's a global apartheid happening, and decision making and how that's done is very, very skewed. But suddenly we're talking about essential workers and who those are. And those are not tax planners and bankers and people who work in stock exchanges. Those are mothers and teachers and frontline workers and nurses, 70% of which are women. And these are people who are really the backbone of who is holding our economy up. And so it's really interesting to see conversations like here in Kenya where we're, beginning to talk about home-based care. But we're not really there yet because we're not asking who is paying for this home-based care and who is actually doing the care work at home. It's something that we go to when our systems and our hospitals are collapsing with the pressures of having too many people. And again, women are there and ready to catch the failings of a system that doesn't really work and uses the labor of many times very invisibilized, not remunerated women's labor and very hard labor. So I also have a hard time calling it care work because it sort of brings up images of cuddles and kisses, whereas it's actual back-breaking, very hard work that's emotionally draining as well. It's carrying water, feeding children, taking care of sick, remembering where the children's socks are. It's all of that I think is not care in that sense. It is care, but it's very, very laborious. But that conversation has come to the fore of COVID and the response that we're seeing. But I must say, I think we need to go a step further and talk about how we're including it in our economic calculations, what that means, where we place it as a priority in our thinking, and as we go forward into post-recovery status. Post-recovery, I don't know what that means. Mishai, you talked about how we can't go back, and that's true. We can't go back to normal because normal was the problem. But suddenly we're also talking about taxes, for example, and how we need to be taxing multinationals. And suddenly that's a conversation that is at the table, again, in a very progressive way. The devil is always in the details. So what that means in panning it out and what it means for just plugging very inconsequential details and not really going to the root of what has caused a lot of this inequality. The Africa is growing narrative that has been seen but we ask Africa is growing for who when it's only 1%, and our inequality figures are growing just as in tandem as with our economic growth by GDP. So I think there's a lot more questioning of terminologies. Why do we use GDP as a measure of growth, for example, for our countries and for our continent, when we know that it's a very flawed measure it's a very flawed measure. And I think those questions, just in conversation with people around me who are not really in the space of governance or economic justice, and just everyday citizens beginning to ask very interesting questions around where our government is prioritizing government spending, for example, what we prioritize as governments, as continents, and where we're placed as a priority in the world, I think has been really interesting for me.
Okay, so you've picked on several issues, and I think we're going to hopefully come to unpacking all of them. The question of a skewed global economy, but even within our own a national economy, the question of who's carrying the burden, who's benefiting, what are the things that we count, that we do not count, what is visible, what is not visible, what kind of questions are people now asking that perhaps people have not been asking. And I think really importantly, the way that this season has taken economics into the public sphere, that people who are often left out of these conversations are now in the conversation and are asking very critical questions. Thank you, Crystal. We're going to come back. And one really important thing you said is, how did we get here? I'd really like us to go back and ask, where did we come from and how did we get here? Grieve, can I come to you next? What for you has been the thing that's been most glaring and you would like us to think about a little bit more in this season?
Thanks, Mishai, for that question. So I think, like you said in the introduction to this program, the COVID situation has given us a reason to pause and just to reflect and to think. I think for me, there are two things really. I mean, the one thing that I think it has really laid bare is the idea that we in Africa have neglected expenditure on our social sector spending. So we've neglected expenditure on education, we've neglected expenditure on health. I mean, as it is today, we seem to have done relatively well, given the dire projections about COVID that were given, say, in January and February. Part of that might be due to luck. Part of it might be due to that we have some, we have some intellectual capital, we have some experience with dealing with infectious diseases that might have helped in this time around. We're trying as best as we can with testing and tracing, and many of these things are things we've learned with infectious diseases in the past. We've always been ravaged by infectious diseases, but I think we could have done a whole lot more. And now we are worried because it seems to be getting a little bit out of hand. And that's because we've neglected expenditure on healthcare, expenditure on education, expenditure on research and development, these kinds of things. I think it has made it rather bare now that these things are public goods, these are social goods. The returns are much, much higher than the private returns. And what African governments ought to do is to go back to the immediate post-independence era paradigm of spending a whole lot more on this. This is what this has laid bare for me on the one hand. Quickly, in terms of economic management, on economic development, economic management side, I think it has laid bare our faulty economic model of trying to develop using services. A lot of our African countries, as you can know, tend to have a relatively large services sector for their level of development, right? So you see it in Kenya, for example. In Kenya, you're very reliant on tourism, which has completely run dry, right? The same case is the same as a story in Zambia, where I'm from. We also rely on tourism. We have all sorts of tourism development plans, tourism enhancement plans, kind of things. And the same in South Africa, where I'm from. So that has run dry. And clearly, if your economy is really based on tourism, then you're going to suffer. So again, it has laid bare sort of a fallacious model of development, which puts services ahead of things like manufacturing and so on and so forth. So for me, these are the two issues that I think have really exposed us as the African continent. Yeah.
Well, okay, spending on public goods and economic management. Thank you. Prof, what comes to your mind? I seem to have lost Prof temporarily. I'm sure he's going to be coming back. But as we wait for Prof to come back, I want us to take a step back. And both of you made mention of where we have come from. would you like to just say a little bit more? When you say where we have come from, where have we come from? Is this sickness in terms of whether it is our planning or the things that we are now seeing and we are saying this isn't working, is this new? Or is this just the way things have been and will continue to be? Grief, perhaps you could start us off with a historical perspective. Where has this come from?
So when you say where has this come from, the COVID situation itself, or for example,
the way we think about what we spend our money on in terms of public goods, the way we have structured our economic management, the way we are managing the way. How have we got to where we are? What has brought us to this place?
You're right. That's a good question, Mishai. And I think for most people, when we try to think about, Africa's economic story and economic history, and I think this is where Prof. Zeleza has made some of his biggest contributions to scholarship. Most people don't know that, if we think about 1960 as the model independence year, whereby many African countries in the 60s, at least a critical mass of them, got independence. Most people don't realize that in the 10 or 15 or 20 years after 1960, our economic models were pretty different to what they are, in fact, drastically different to how they are today. So we had an ethos back then of putting people first, spending on our people, capacitating our people, making sure people are very educated, making sure our people are very healthy. I mean, obviously we had to build cohesive state, very strong, national identities. So our post-independence leaders immediately had this ethos of spending on education, on healthcare, and which they did. So you find that a lot of social spending was done in the immediate post-independence era. On the economic side, we also had, a model that said the state is very much involved in directing the economy. And we had an idea that, for example, to develop, you have to grow a manufacturing industrial base. And that's because that's the lesson of history. And Prof. Zeleza, is much better placed than I am to talk about that. But that's the lesson of history, that you have to build off a manufacturing base and then subsequently transition into something else like services. So at some point in the 80s, there was a big ideological currents in the world. There was Reaganism, Thatcherism in the world, this triumph of neoliberalism. And then sadly, it is at that time that African countries went into economic crisis, right? So we go into an economic crisis at a point that there's there are changes in ideological currents around the world. And obviously the diagnosis of the crisis was that what you had been doing immediately after independence is what has led you to where you are today. So there was a big misdiagnosis of the crisis. And the solution was simple: get the state out of the economy, let the economy automatically on its own take you to the promised land, which took us into this heavily services dependent economy. And then on the social spending side, you need to cut back expenditure. You need to retrench public expenditure. So this is briefly, Mishai, sort of a story of how we got to where we are today. Yeah.
Okay, so we started from actually prioritizing these public goods, but then with time, and we can actually, all of us, look at African countries and see how this has deteriorated. Prof, we've been talking about how the spending on public goods and also the question of economic management has become very salient to us during this season. I wondered what for you might have been the characteristics that COVID-19 has brought to your mind, and perhaps where do you think it has come from? How did we get to this place?
So my apologies for getting kicked out of the meeting. I think the COVID-19 has exposed a number of dynamics, some of which, of course, were there, and many of us were aware of them, but I think they've become very apparent to even the ordinary person in the street or on the farm and so on. One is, I think, what you've just been talking about, that it has exposed all the dysfunctions and the problems of neoliberal growth, neoliberal hegemony, in which the supremacy was placed on the free market. And it was, of course, argued that the state was irrelevant, and investment in social sectors such as education and health and so on was deemed as irrelevant. And I think, following up on what my colleague just spoke about, after independence, immediately after that, what we had was what I call in my own work authoritarian developmentalism. The backlog of development was so huge, and the hunger for development was so strong because of the independence struggle, that governments at that time invested quite heavily in infrastructure, in of course, education, in health, which the expect masses wanted us to be done. And of course, Africa grew fairly rapidly between the 1960s and the before the onset of the global crisis, beginning with the increase in oil prices. And then this era was followed by one of structural in the 1980s and 1990s, the so-called lost 2 decades of Africa, during which, of course, the state was supposed to be rolled back, and investment in social sectors, in the public sector, was supposed to be, was supposed to be overtaken by the market and divestment from those sectors, and of selling of public assets, of parastatals, and so on and so forth started. And this is a period we all know is the lost decades of Africa. Now, what we've been seeing since the early 2000s is a third period in which growth recovered. It recovered under very interesting political dispensation, namely struggles for democracy. So the challenge of the last 20 years has been, how do you, construct democratic development of states in which development is inclusive, it's integrated, is innovative, and is sustainable. That, of course, has not yet been realized. And COVID-19 has thrown up all challenges of trying to construct a developmental democratic state.
Wow, thank you very much. So in that case then, Crystal, you mentioned a couple of things and said we need to pay attention to this and this and that. And I wonder if you want to say anything about how we got there. How is it that, for instance, when you say that certain vulnerable communities or certain communities have been marginalized in this making of the economy, in all the things that we pay attention to, why did that happen? We've talked about what happened with the public goods, but what about all the rest of it?
So I think for the way neoliberalism and capitalism is structured, something needs to subsidize it. I've spoken about women's labor, but also everything from the global south has subsidized a global economy for very many years. Through the slave trade period, the African countries and the global south in general, well, African countries, especially for the slave trade, really did subsidize a global economy that made sure they were producing cotton and sugar that went into their industrial revolution. But the narratives around what that industrial revolution was and how we didn't do it, and on what backs in terms of the damage that we've done to, or the world has done to climate and planet, but also whose labor and on what terms this growth that the world is supposedly going through, I think is on the backs of some parts of the globe. But I think we cannot forget what a global, and I call it a global economic governance structure, has meant for us as Africans. Professor and Dr. Reeve have also mentioned, from post-independence economic narratives and philosophies, and then come in the Washington Consensus with the World Bank and the IMF, and they placed on us the structural adjustment programs to the 80s and 90s, which really defunded a lot of programs by the state, and public goods and services were almost completely defunded. And if you remember, it's when there's a generation of Kenyans, and I'm sure of Africans, that have no living memory of what public services and goods looks like, feels like, works like. And so I think that is also an interesting angle that we need to remember. If you have a citizenry that has no living memory of what a government should be doing and what this social contract between state and citizen should look like, how then should they demand for anything better? With that also came this narrative that private sector and the market will fix everything. And so this notion that private everything is better than government services and goods has stuck with us. And so we're going into a new phase, as Prof said, but we've gone from the Washington Consensus, which was the structural adjustment programs and all of those interventions, into this over-focus and reliance on private finance, and which some have labeled the Wall Street consensus and really looking at private finance as a silver bullet to all our problems. Now that comes with a whole array of questions around who's at the table when those decisions and priorities are set, who's paying for it, and how do we pay for it? And I think that is an increasingly important question, especially as we go through this crisis.
So I want us to really spend time thinking about where do we want to go so that we don't spend all the time thinking, looking back and thinking about now. But before we do that, I'm going to ask all three of you to identify what do you think are two things we must, that are the priorities of the moment? Here are two areas. These are the economies as we have them. Yes, we will want to work towards changing them. We can imagine what the future would look like. But right now, here are two either sectors of the economy or two things that we must pay attention to that we can address and we need to start addressing as Africans. Whoever wants to go first. Prof, would you like to start us off on this one?
Yeah. I think there are a number of things we need to talk about in terms of where we want to go. We have to know, obviously, where we have come from, and I'm talking like a historian in that sense, and what this crisis is exposing. And I think it has exposed a number of things, which, of course, the flip side of those things is precisely some of the solutions, the opportunities. One is, of course, we have already talked about the hegemony of neoliberalism, I think is. The other thing that is also, I think, under threat is high globalization. One, of course, failed, led to the explosion of pandemic across the world, and the other one failed to protect citizens from the pandemic. Thing which is also very clear that the United States, that were believed to be prepared, they had the capacity to deal with this, within a crisis. It has been shown to be empty because when the crisis hit Europe, they went into a lot of challenges. And of course, the US is still grappling and frankly failing in dealing with this issue. The other thing that it has exposed is that national security, the way we think about national security, is not about defense in terms of military defense. It's about investment in people, investment in social safety nets, and so on and so forth. And then it has also exposed that the anthropocentric view of the world, of nature, that we humans are so advanced that we are almost immune to challenges, it's obviously nonsense. And our technologies have not really protected us from the coronavirus. And of course, what we may have discussed in previous programs, the nature of work, the nature of education, all those have been shown to be not necessarily as resilient as we would like them to be in terms of dealing with the crisis. Which means the flip side of that is that Africa cannot look to the West as containing solutions, because the West itself is not in a position. It has demonstrated incapacity to deal with this crisis. So we have to become a lot more self-reliant and think through what the challenges are, which means for me, we have to seriously think about investing in public infrastructure, investing in the social sector, health and education, and building our human capital. Because without doing that, you're not going to go very far. And fundamentally, it means really taking quite seriously, climate issues, climate change, human security. That means beyond, armaments and all that. And in fact, human security is about, human well-being, capacity to deal with crisis. And we have to build resilience in our societies, resilience in our populations, which means at a fundamental level, this is a moral and philosophical question about what we are as human beings. What kind of society do we want to create? What kind of systems do we want to create that support human well-being, that support meaningful life for our people?
Wow, so this is really the project of reimagining. We have to start within as opposed to relying to what other people will tell us this is what we need to do. Grieve, how do you think, what are some of the things then when we start from saying, what are our priorities? What are our concerns? How do we self-finance? You know, we're so used to looking outside for that. What are the priorities there? Where do we start?
Thanks, Mishai, for that question. I think I will sort of carry on from where Prof left off. I mean, so I think one of the things that Prof said, which actually is really important in thinking about this COVID moment, is this idea. We always talk about homegrown solutions, about always one not employing one size fits all, always contextualizing solutions. And we think we've learned from history. But I mean, this year has driven home the point that as Africans, we still continue to outsource thinking to others. So an example is precisely how we've handled the lockdowns, right? So initially, when the virus became quite evident and that it was going to be a big deal for the world, many African countries had some versions of lockdowns or some versions of some curfews, right? But at the wrong time, at a time when our caseloads were very low. Everybody else in the West who had a huge burden at the time quickly went into lockdown mode. And then we copied and pasted exactly that on this end, right? Now we're at the point where the virus might be getting a little, burden might be growing, right? And there's possibility that we might have to introduce some reintroduce some versions of lockdowns, but we've already spent that social capital, that political capital 3 months ago. Right? Our citizens are fatigued. So again, I think it drives home the point that we need to bring back thinking, our own thinking into the design of policies, right? We need to think hard about policies, contextualize policies, and not just copy and paste. And we keep doing it. And I think we've done it again this year with COVID. It might be fatal. But the other most substantive point I want to make is about building capable states. I think we need to build the states that can do many of the things that Prof has just laid out there. We need to build states that can provide public goods, that can provide education, healthcare, infrastructure, and do it very well. We need to have a good civil service, a very well remunerated public workers. We need to professionalize our civil services. They're already lots of good people work there, but we need to capacitate those people to do their job. We need to capacitate our revenue authorities to collect taxes that can allow governments to spend on all these goods and services. Again, I go back to history as a student of Prof's copious writings. We built some versions of capable states in the 60s and 70s. We need to go back and study that period and figure out, how did we get that right? How did we get civil servants? How did we get public servants? How did we get capable states, right? How did we grow capable states in such a short space of time? One of the most underappreciated things about the African continent, at least many African countries, is that within a very short space of time, from a backlog of development, as Prof put it, we were able to build capable states rather quickly, states that were then destroyed in the 80s and 90s. So I think the most important thing is we need to rebuild our states and the capacity of our states to be able to do the things that states are supposed to do: provide security, provide healthcare, provide social services, infrastructure, and so on and so forth. Disease surveillance. Yeah, this is, I think, one of the biggest issues that we have to think about.
What if somebody was to argue, and I'm going to ask Crystal to answer this. What if somebody was to argue that, look, that was fine. At that point, we were able to do that, but we also really relied on the rest of the world to finance what we were able to do then. And really, the crisis began in the 80s and 90s because the rest of the world began to say, we're not willing to finance you to do what you want to do. Crystal, you mentioned tax. Grieve has just talked about we need to be able to resource ourselves. Build strong revenue authorities. Do we have the capacity, honestly and sincerely, to collect enough money from within our countries to do this ourselves? Aren't we completely indebted to the rest of the world, given what you had said, that there is a skewed global economy where the money really is, the wealth is out there, it's not in here? Can we do this?
Yeah, and I'd also like to question, are we indebted to the rest of the world, or are they indebted to us? And it depends on, the politics of narratives and who's telling the story. But I think Yes, definitely we can. Africa loses, and I know Gree will speak to, actual national level taxation, but I will speak to a global governance system. Africa loses at least $100 billion in illicit financial flows every single year. And that's a very, very, very kind estimate as to how much we lose. Only 5% of that is through corruption. 65% of that is through commercial activity. So it's a multinationals that operate within our jurisdiction and within our borders, finding loopholes in our tax frameworks and legal systems to ensure that they're moving their profits into lower tax rate countries like Mauritius, the Cayman Islands, and all these other tax havens. And so the work that they're doing here, using what they need here, extracting what they extract from here, is not taxed where it's done. And so there needs to be a serious question around what that really means. And there's been a push for the last few years towards having a global tax body. Right now, tax frameworks are set by the OECD, which is really, a group of very rich countries. We don't have representation at the table, but yet we are supposed to implement these frameworks on what they call equal footing. How equal that footing is can be questioned. And so there's a push to democratize that process and have a global tax body situated within the framework of the United Nations, which gives all of us fair voice. We also need to remember that very, very broadly, and I've spoken to this before, the global south, and this includes Africa, Latin America, Asia, produces over 60% of raw materials and over 60% of labor. We only accrue less than 5% of global wealth. And again, you can see what that means. We're exporting raw materials, but also our labor is fueling the rest of the world and this economic growth that the world is enjoying, but we're accruing almost nothing of it. And I think there needs to be a question in rebasing what that machinations look like. And really at the heart of the economic struggle is a question of power and who has power. And economics is fairly simple. It's basically, where do we get the money from and who are you taxing and how do you make sure that you're doing that in a fair way? But then on the other hand, it's how do you spend this money and how equitably and just do you spend this money in terms of what priorities are needed by your people, by your citizens. I think there's two questions around both wealth redistribution, which taxation will answer, but there's also a very interesting question around wealth generation and where that comes from. And Mariana Mazzucato has done has written quite extensively on this. But the place of the state to generate wealth and to commandeer the generation of wealth directed at its own people. And there's a question in the comment section from Natasha who, talks about private sector being good and addressing inequality, and especially in the education sector. I'd like to push back a little bit, and I strongly believe there are some elements of our society, education being one, healthcare, transport, that need to be within the hands of the state. It means that they're able to equitably distribute, and history and research and our own lived experiences have shown, as much as the private sector is lauded as more efficient, is what they use in terms of definition, it is not equitable at all. If you attach a user fee, you mean not everyone can access a hospital, a school. And what does that mean for a country, for a state, as you're trying to grow and grow your people? And I think this is also tied to a political project that we must put at the center of our policy making, our policy thinking. And I think that's where we've lost it a little bit. As we've said, we've outsourced our thinking. We need to reclaim it back to be able to put our own people and the good of our own people at the center of this decision-making process.
Okay, so I want to go to the questions that are coming up in the chat, but before I do that, I want to know, so I'm going to give you a bit of a puzzle to work on collectively. The year is 2050, and Professor Zeleza is has been this huge conference that he's decided to organize, and the keynote speakers are the three of you, right? And you are here because you are Africa's top thinkers. What you started to do in 2020 completely changed the economy of this continent and of the world. And in 2030, Africa has gathered to hear you tell them, what was it that you did? The 2, 3 important things that the 3 of you came together and said, here we are. Professor Chelwa, Professor Zeleza, and the eminent Ms. Crystal Simeone, whom the whole world knows. Tell us, what are the 2 or 3 things, each of you, practical? Now we know we have thought it through, we've done the research, we've done everything, and then you sat down and you convinced this continent to do 3 things. Let me know, what are those 3 things? Which one of you, Professor Chelwa, Professor Zeleza, Your Excellency, Ms. Simeone, tell me what you did.
But by then I'll be a very, very old man, hopefully still able to talk.
Eminent Professor Emeritus.
The answer is very simple. As Simeone said, development and economics at one level is extremely simple, at another level is very complicated. And we all know that old analysis of development that is based on race or based on geography or where your country is located, based on culture or based on sort of your civilization, all that is nonsense. Nobody believes in that anymore. I think there are 4 key things that we need to think about that would make us in 2050 a very different place. One is, it's human capital. Human capital is absolutely essential for development. And our data on human capital development is very weak. Let me just give you a couple of figures. So the entire African continent, in terms of enrollment ratios, is 13% for higher education. Sub-Saharan Africa is 9%, Kenya is 11%, and so on and so forth. For your South Korea, which was 40, 50 years ago, similar to Africa, is 94%. So that tells you a lot in itself. Human capital development. We have to make massive, massive investments in higher education and education as a whole. That's the first thing. The second thing about development is what some people call institutional arrangements, capacity of the state, what Grieve was talking about. They need to build the capacities of our states to be able to deliver development, to be able to deliver public goods, to be able to regulate the economy in such a way that it is productive. The third thing, which is absolutely essential, is of course social capital. Some economists talk about trust, social capital of trust. I'll give you a very silly example. Most of our elites don't trust their own countries, and that lack of trust manifests itself in not only sending their kids abroad to get educated, not here, and when they get sick, they abroad, not in our hospitals, because they know they're not well capacitated. But even more egregiously is what Krista was talking about, this massive exportation of African capital by our own people, let alone through exploitation of the global system. And the final thing is, how are we integrated into the world economy? As Al-Mazrui used to put it, are we pawns or players in the global system? Which entails for African countries to work together much more closely than we in fact is evident from the rhetoric. So the free trade area for Africa, the regional economic communities of the continent, those are absolutely essential. So I would hope in 2050, we are a highly educated continent in terms of human capital, capable states, and into the world economy, not as the hewers and drawers of wood and drawers of wood, processes of exchange, but in the key institutions that make decisions.
Wow, thank you very much, Professor Zeleza. Networks of continental support, education, strengthening our states, and making sure that we take our rightful place in the whole global order. Thank you very much. Grieve, tell us, what did you do, Professor Chelwa? It was such an honor working with you over the next 30 years.
Yeah, I mean, if that is if I still have a job in the academy, you know, current trends of defunding higher education in Africa might lead to a position where I don't have a job anymore. I mean, Professor Zeleza is a tough act to follow. I mean, what he has articulated there is very little that I can add to it, except again to just say we need to, I hope, you know, we bring back this idea that development is intentional, development as intentionality, you know. You have to drive, you know, the process of development. We have to bring back this idea that to get to point B, we have to draw up a plan of how to get to point B. We have to invest in people, as Prof has said, we have to grow capable states, but this doesn't happen automatically. This cannot happen via the market. You know, I mean, even though some of the ideas of the SAP years, we all know now that they were quite wrong, but those ideas are still with us. You know, they're still with my generation, sadly. You know, the ideas that things happen automatically, that we can craft public sphere, private spheres in the public sphere, and this is going to lead us to the promised land. Those ideas, we have to sort of throw them out the window. I think just to bring back this idea of development as intentional. You know, you have to drive the development process. So I hope in 2030 or in 2050, starting today, that our governments will now realize that development is intentional, development is planned, development is deliberate. It doesn't happen automatically. And to be able to do all that, we have to do all the things that Prof has said, have highly educated people, you know, fund research and development, fund infrastructure, you know, come up with capable states, also think quite deeply as a continent about how we interact with the rest of the world. We can't keep on, as Prof has said, we can't keep on exporting raw materials anymore. We have to, you know, grab back the initiative. We have to add value to what we produce. We have to make sure that, you know, our farmers in Ghana or Ivory Coast are not just exporting raw cocoa, you know, they should do chocolates. You know, we have to make sure that my own country, Zambia, we're not just exporting raw copper. We have to add value to that. Prof's country of birth, Malawi, you have to make sure that you're not just exporting tea, you know, in its raw format or whatever. You have to do stuff to do that. So I think this is how I hope that by 2050, this idea of development as intentional would have been re-ingrained in us, because we had it. So I hope it can be re-ingrained in our policymakers, and we can be able to deliberately drive the process of development to the place where we want it to be. That's my submission.
Thank you. So development is being intentional, and also it being driven by us rather than us being driven by other people's developmental needs or economic needs. Thank you very much. Your Excellency, Eminence, Crystal Simeone, what did you do?
That's a tough act to follow, Prof, and Reeve. I would really like to say that we burnt it all down, this whole system. We just, you know, burnt it all down. It doesn't work for us, but I know I can't say that. So what I'd like to say instead is, and someone spoke about education, I think we need to really pay attention to what sort of education our children are going through, and try as much as we can to decolonize that education. I am convinced that the change that I would like to see isn't going to be seen in my lifetime, but we need to start the work now. We're sort of obsessed with the inputs of our education. How many teachers, how many schools, how many laptops have we sent to our children or not? But the question around outcomes, what are our children learning, and for what sort of systems are they learning for, I think is very, very important. I myself have to constantly unlearn a lot of things and decolonize my own brain. So even as I'm writing, who am I quoting in my writing? Am I quoting, you know, Foucault because that's who I think I need to be quoting, or am I quoting Professor Zeleza and Grieve in my work, and how many women am I quoting? So I think all of that goes into the work on building, for lack of a better term, building our own self-confidence, if you will. It's almost like we need to go to a confidence skills training of some sort. But I think really at the heart of it, education is key. I question our debt. And so in my burning things down, I would really like for Africa to say no. But we all know our history of what that means. And I've been talking about Sankara a lot, and he died not soon after he spoke about debt cancellation at the AU summit, and very famously said, if we try and pay back this debt, for sure our people will die. We will not be able to provide. But if we don't, nobody dies, neither you nor us. And so that I would like to reimagine and bring back that sort of thinking around cancellation of debt, because we've paid many times over, and we need to have a deeper conversation on what this debt is doing to us. And then very closely linked to that is I would really like to recenter, and this goes to what we were talking about, I would really like to center development on people and citizens, and really bringing back a social contract and really the details of what that means and who's making decisions. And why should the World Bank or the IMF have direct impact on decision making around maternal health care in a rural town in Kenya, whereas the women who are actually experiencing those services or lack of those services have no say over what sort of services they need to be having. The role of private sector in setting priorities for what our country needs in terms of development, where you have mega infrastructure being built at the expense of public healthcare structures. And this has really been brought out by COVID, where Kenya almost has no community health workers, because that we've sort of completely outsourced that to bilaterals like USAID and the like. And so our government has no real control no real control over community health. We don't even have a community health structure per se, really, but we have the SGR. And so in a moment of crisis, what really matters at that point, I think, is questionable. So like Breathe and Prof says, a reimagining and a reclaiming of what our historical ways of governance and of processes were in the post-independent 60s and 70s, and really coming back to centering not private finance, but centering citizens and their needs. And it's possible our constitution upholds that. As everything else, we have everything on paper. It's the implementation of it where we sort of go astray. But I think that for me would be the top things that we need to think about.
Wow, I really want to ask each of you guys to give me one model, but I'm not going to go there yet. I want to go to the questions. We have some amazing questions, and I want us to go straight onto the questions. Let me remind everybody that this is the 4th Corona Café on economics that is hosted by IFRA, Alliance Française, and The Elephant. And we are now tackling the questions that have come from the participants within the webinar. Let me start with Seku Otondi. I think this question came almost as soon as we started. And he is wondering, how can policymakers ensure that health and other national public goods touching on human security, which are transboundary in nature, are transformed into regional, if not international, public goods, accessible to the majority ordinary citizens and not just the few select elites who can afford it. I think this speaks to something, Crystal, you were talking about, this thing of where the private people who can afford private services get quality, and those who have to live on public services get something that's really not as good. And his question is within the fact that health as it currently exists, is for many people remains a national public good. Any one of you who would like to take that one?
I mean, I can attempt a response, and then colleagues can add in. I think, I mean, so it's quite important to also understand how it is that we on this continent all of a sudden got private provision of what are supposed to be public goods. I think this came out of the fact that in the 80s and 90s, during the time we were, retrenching the state and rolling back the state, I mean, the private sphere had to pop up to fill the deficit. But obviously the economics of it are such that only a few people can pay, right, for that private sphere. So I think in this idea of trying to build up capable states and states that can provide public goods like healthcare much more adequately, the important thing is to think about domestic resource mobilization. So I think for me, one of the most important things is that our policymakers, as far as I understand it, know what ought to be done. When I speak to people at the Ministry of Health in Zambia, for example, I mean, they can give you a whole dissertation on what needs to be done. But I think where they are really constrained is on the resource side. They don't have the money to be able to have all these health centers built, to be able to have them staffed with adequately trained health workers, to be able to have the laboratory facilities. Now we're talking about personal protective equipment and all these kinds of things. So I think for me, one of the most important thing in this discussion is to start on the resource mobilization front. We need to collect taxes, right? We need to collect taxes. We can't outsource resource mobilization to donors anymore. We can't outsource resource mobilization to foreign private capital or capital flows, as Simeone has said, Christo has said. So I think one of the most important things that we need to do is to mobilize resources. Then we put those resources in the hands of our policymakers, who, by the way, know what ought to be done, just that they're constrained from a resource point of view. That would be my sort of submission.
Okay. Any of the others want to answer or say something there?
Yeah, I would like to add by saying that, Kelwa, your countrywoman, the Miss Moyo, I think put it very well in Dead Aid. Aid and donations will not develop Africa. No country in the world has been developed by other people. The people themselves take charge of their own development. As Chelwa said, it has to be intentional. And policymakers, just like any elites, or people in power, do not make changes because they necessarily want to. You have to force them. There has to be social movements. There has to be political pressure. And we have to ask ourselves, what is the nature of our political culture, our political socialization, and the nature of our social movements? To what extent can these social movements be the pressure points for change? Independence did not come because the British were convinced we need to give the natives independence. People fought, people died. The struggle for racial equality did not come because science had proven that race doesn't exist. People protested through the civil rights movement, and they're still protesting now, as we see through the George Floyd protests. So the question we have to ask ourselves, what are the pressure points in African countries for change, for truly meaningful change, for transformative change to take place in our societies? Because this is not going to come because Zeleza or Simeone or Chelwa have written a nice paper to say we need change. Change doesn't happen that way. In other words, while we are in the business of producing knowledge, we need to be a little more humble to realize that knowledge in itself does not bring change. It's essential, obviously, in terms of making sure that it informs good policies and all that. But real change comes out of social struggles. So the question is, what is the nature of social struggles in our societies now? And we as intellectuals, part of our business is to understand those social struggles. What is the composition of these movements, the social composition, in terms of gender, in terms of class, in terms of age, in terms of location, and what are the alliances in these movements? What are the spheres in which these struggles are being fought? Economic, social, political, cultural, environmental, you name it, even artistic. What is the role of the arts in social struggles, in social movements? What is the scale of these movements at a local level, at a national level, at regional and international level? What are the alliances that are being formed across all these spaces? And what are the goals of these movements? Because not all social movements are progressive. Some are very dangerous, very retrogressive. They want to reimpose patriarchy. They want to reimpose religious authoritarianism. They want to reimpose populist nationalism and so on and so forth. So the goals in themselves are also critical. And what is their organization? Formal, informal, covert and overt, and so on and so forth. So part of, I think, our job as intellectuals at this moment, as scholars, is to try to understand what's really, really going on in our societies, because that will help us to do something that Chelwa mentioned very clearly, not to export thinking. Let's think about what's really going on in our societies and what are the pressure points that will lead to policy changes that are meaningful and sustainable and transformative.
Crystal, in bringing you in, I want to quote from Shiron Dua, who says, we articulate to identify the problems. And certainly the intellectuals have said, we will sit down, we will think, we will articulate them. But her question is, where do we start? How do we move from thinking, articulating it, and saying, this is what we're going to do, to mobilizing the bulk of African citizens to actually get this work doing? And I'm asking you that because I know that's what you've been trying. You've devoted your life to doing, is getting ordinary, everyday people to see this, to work on these issues. So what are the practical things we can do to mobilize more of us who are not involved at the moment into that work?
So I think this platform is a start because it popularizes, for lack of a better term, the conversations and narratives that sometimes feel very, very far removed and usually take place in halls and rooms of power like that African Union, our regional bodies, the United Nations. But I think in these spaces, we have access to brilliant minds like Dr. Chelwa, Professor Zaleza, and I think this is exactly where the change begins. I think there is power in these spaces in having people understand processes that exist. So for example, when you're looking at taxation, the African Tax Administrators Forum has some amazing tax model laws that we can use in all our countries to ensure that we are taxing fairly and making sure that we're retaining taxation that's properly due to us from multinational corporations especially. All we need to do is make sure that we're pushing our own governments and putting pressure on them to make sure that we're implementing these tax models that have been retrofit for our specific, context and nuances. So it's moving away from what OECD tells us to do and tax models that are very foreign, very global north focused, and very extractive in nature. But ATAP is African Tax Administrators Forum. ATAP's models have been designed by us and for us. So I think that's an important, very practical step that's there. They've already put the frameworks out. All we need to do is make sure that we're pushing our governments to implement in our countries. I think the next step is what I personally do as well, is decolonize my own mind and thinking. And it's reading the work of Dr. B. Chelwa, it's reading the work of Paul Zaleza, it's reading the work of Dr. Mishai Mangola, but also remembering our oral culture and literature. And I know Mishai can speak to this, but really recreate our own narratives. And there's so much power in narratives and what sort of narratives we're forming and by who and about what. I think that's a good way to start. And also taking responsibility in our active citizenship and what meaningful public participation actually means. When there's a public hearing on the budget, are we making sure that we're reading and that we're commenting and making sure that our priorities are in there? Because it's nobody else's work but ours. And I think that is a really very low-hanging fruit, for lack of a better term again, that we can all do. It really goes a long way that our constitution not only suggests that we do it, but upholds our right to do it. And I think we really need to make sure that we're living up to our responsibility in this and making sure that that happens.
So starting to move beyond waiting for other people to do it, but taking responsibility. It's interesting, you've spoken so much on education. Peter Magati has done a really interesting post where he talks about looking at the history of why African economies were arm twisted into adopting SAPs. And he actually especially speaks about the unsustainable public service model post-independence, arguing that to accommodate the African population, given that the quest for land was not coming through, these young governments perceived public service on a fallback plan, that the government was the main employer and provider of goods and services, but then they had to keep borrowing. To the point where public debt was becoming unsustainable, and this is what brought in the SAPs. So really, he's reiterating that point. We need to understand our history, we need to read, we need to, and he then argues that unless we invest in proper educational philosophy in our education system that kicks out the colonial legacy, we will remain in the unending cycle of poverty and unbelief. So I think many people are agreeing with you. I'm curious though, what's the place of the private sector? Crystal seems to dismiss really the private sector, not to dismiss it, to argue that, look, that shouldn't be where our focus is. Natasha Chilundika, however, says that while she agrees with you, Crystal, the reality is that the current fiscal capacity will not meet the demand for the capacity building required to move Africa forward. Zambia, for example, spends only 10% of its national budget on all social programs. So she's arguing that we cannot move away from the private sector playing not only a role, but a key role in this sector. And that if the private sector does not address inequality, it will just get worse. So what would any one of you say to this? Dr. Chelwa, I am checking that figure of 10%. Zambia is only spending 10% on its public services with you. But what would your comment be? What's the role of the public sector in all this?
I mean, I should start off by saying three friends I know quite closely have commented. So Seku Otondi, Peter Magati, and Natasha Chilundika. So these are very good friends of mine. So I asked them to I'm happy. I think so. I think the most important thing again is to learn from history. Right? You know, I think Professor Zeleza's writings, we need to reread those writings because it will make us understand where we are today. So the private sector in Africa is many ways a creature of omission, right? It's not a creature of commission. It is not like we sat down and said, let us have private provision of healthcare. It came up precisely because the state was being rolled back, right? When structural adjustment happened, the state was rolled back, and because the state left a gap, a deficit, the private sphere popped up. So you saw private schools popping up in the late 80s, early 90s. I mean, like Mishai, you and I had a conversation last week where we said, for many people, private schools were a 90s phenomenon, right? They weren't there in the 60s and 70s. They might have been there, but they were really marginal. So I think it's important to understand the emergence, the origins of the private sector. Private sector was a creature of omission. So from that point of view, then it becomes really tricky to want to give a creature of omission the reins to drive our development process, right? Now, it is not to argue that there's no role for the private sector. I mean, there's what is called state failures, and there's some things, for example, we don't want the government or the state to be providing cinema services, or to be creating music, or to be, there's some things, or to be making ice creams. Those things can be done by the private sector, right? But there are some very critical things. There are some things that are really important for development, things whose social returns are so high that they surpass what the private returns. They're so high that they can only be provided by the state adequately on large scale. Education is incredibly important. Healthcare, incredibly important. Very few places in the world have developed by abrogating those responsibilities to the private sphere. So I think this is what would be my submission: understanding the origins of the emergence of the private sector in Africa as a creature of omission, as well as understanding the role of private sector in the development process. Not to say they can't be private sector, ought to be private sector, but not in the very critical roles. Those things really have to be driven by the state. That is my answer. Yeah.
I'm going to push Professor Zeleza to also answer this, given that he's Vice Chancellor of a private university in this critical sector of education. So, Prof, how would you see this? How does the private sector fit in with the very important imperative?
Yeah, I think I'll echo what Griff said. The private sector is, of course, very important, but we have to ask ourselves a couple of questions. One is, what has been the historical role of the private sector in Africa, certainly since independence? How nationalistic, how much is it wedded to the national project of democratic, developmental society and state? So that's I think still an open question. In the 70s, we used to talk about the comprador bourgeoisie. It's no longer popular to talk about that. But I think some of the questions we were raising in the 1970s about the African capitalist class are still very crucial questions. Tandika Nkandawire, the late Tandika Nkandawire, one of Africa's greatest thinkers in development economics, used to ask about the patriotic nature of the capitalist class in Africa. To what extent are they patriotic? You don't find the British bourgeoisie as much as our own bourgeoisies investing their money abroad. Of course, they have investments, but channeling their money into Swiss banks and so on and so forth, the way our rich do. So the patriotic nature of the private sector and the bourgeoisie in Africa is the question we still need to ask. The second question we need to ask is, what are the value chains that our private capital has been able to develop? And this centers on the whole question of research and development, which Grieve mentioned earlier. To what extent do our major companies, as well as the smaller ones, really invest in research? What research and development, and what kind of relationships do they develop with the tertiary sector? If you take all the big companies, your Microsoft, your IBMs, your General Motors, your GEs, and so on and so forth, not only do they invest massively in their own research in order to continue to raise the value chain. Okay. Hello? Can you hear me? Hello, yeah, so not only do they do that, but they also collaborate with higher education institutions in constantly doing research so that they raise the value of their products or their services and so on. So that's another question that we need to pose to our private sector. I know for a fact that many of them, for example, do not invest in education, higher education. They complain, of course, and rightly in many cases, that the products of our universities are not employable, and one can, of course, agree with some of those criticisms. But to what extent are they investing in research, are investing in education, investing in human capital development as part of that? This is not social welfare, but as a core part of their mandate. And then finally, you find that a lot of our private sectors, and this is evident in the banking sector, they would rather, contracts with the government are really sometimes the main source of their revenues. And that's why also there is this deadly competition for political power. It's an instrument of accumulation. What again in the 70s we used to call primitive accumulation by the African political class and the bourgeoisie. So the issue is, to what extent are they really producing much value outside taxing or collecting from the state?
Thank you very much. We have a question from Martin Joroge, who is wondering, what is your view on the gender dimension in the management of COVID impact on communities, nations, and even globally? Now, even though we're addressing the future, what he's drawing attention to is that we are seeing women leaders beginning to be on the global stage. They seem to be doing better at managing this virus, much more than male counterparts, and wondering not only why this might be the case. I would like to add to that the question of, especially Crystal had put on the table, that more and more women are stepping up to the front and saying we need to rethink how we talk about economics, the kind of things that we bring to the forefront. And we are seeing more and more women in this space, which tends to have been, quote unquote, traditionally gendered male. So what is it that we can say about the role of women, or the role of how we are beginning to see these new perspectives coming up? What is driving this? I think Crystal had talked a little bit about this earlier, but what else is driving this? And how can we make sure that we bring not only, I think, women's voices, the other area that comes up is more younger people. The more marginalized communities, the youth, people who are invested, people who live in rural areas, these more marginalized communities. How do we bring them more to the forefront of this discussion?
Me?
Yes.
I was going to push back on putting the gender question to the only woman on the panel, but I won't.
No, I'm making it a general question, but because you had raised it earlier, so I want you to pick up on that.
I will touch also on the last question on the private sector, and just a reminder that currently Kenya, I think, and I could be wrong on this, but the last time I checked, 56%, our debt to GDP was at 56%. With a growing number of private creditors, we begin to question, as Prof. Zeleza said, what that role and that relationship is. But also there's an article that went out in the last few days that talked about who gets the money. And so we need to really open up what this private sector is and how much of it is actually local. And for the tech industry and startups, only 6% of founders only 6% of companies that are locally founded had access to funding of more than $1 million in 2019. And so they also calculated that a white founder has, listen to this, 47,000% a higher chance to be funded than a local Black startup founder. And so I think this also begs a question that Prof was talking about, who is actually, when we're talking about private sector, it's not, my mother who makes bags for conferences. It's not the lady, selling maize on the side of the road. That's not who we consider as private sector. And I think we really need to be careful around that and whose interest this private sector is. Back to the question, I think with regard to women, yes, women seem to be, New Zealand as a good case, seem to be governing, steering ships in a better direction. But I would like to say gender versus philosophy is can be different, because patriarchy, neoliberalism, those are philosophies or ways of thinking. And you can be a woman, but ascribe to very patriarchal, very neoliberal tenets of thinking. But you can be a man and have feminist ways of thought, right? Because feminism brings questions oppression and centers power at the center of analysis. And I think that as a way of thinking needs to be brought up. And so representation definitely does matter. Rebalancing how many women are in positions of power, are, steering ships. But at the same time, if that ship is not built in a way that can be steered, it's all for naught. And I think we need to question representation, yes, but over and above that, what political ideology, what political project, and what philosophy and tenets does this person uphold and bring to the core? And are we centering well-being, for example, at the heart of what we're making decisions around? And so I think there's very great examples of really progressive, very great examples out there. I've mentioned New Zealand as one, even in Kenya as well. I've worked a little bit with women's rights groups working in this COVID pandemic and crisis. And again, the gaps that we see are very structural. So funding to gender departments has been almost non-existent up until now. And so you just don't have enough people with that right analysis to sit on all the different committees that are coming up to inform strategies and processes to go forward. So, and that's showing when you see, Machakos, when they had all the huge number of teen pregnancies coming up as a result of the lockdown or the containment, this is as a result of years of the wrong policies and not enough funding and resourcing going into gender departments, for example, making sure there's gender experts in all our committees, in all our ministries, in the whole process, in the whole value chain of our decision-making process. And I think that has been again brought to the fore, in that we can't begin to fix things now with band-aid solutions. A lot of them are structural and go back to how we formulate what governance structures look like and what sort of ideology again governs those processes. So with regard to a feminist analysis, a feminist approach, I think it's an approach rather than an embodiment of a human body. But at the same time, representation is really matters.
And do you or any of the others want to comment on? So for me, the broader question is about moving the center, not just having people who represent, whether it is gender or generation, or even moving out of the capital cities in terms of who gets to be at the table, but literally shifting the way the discourse happens, shifting who is at the center of the conversation, And I know, Prof, you've written a lot about this and the question of globalization in general, shifting which countries determine whether the world, when something goes wrong in that country, whether the world collapses. So when we talk about, right now, when we think of who sneezes and the whole world catches a cold, we're not thinking about Africa in the economic front, right? But how do we shift it? So I guess my question is, how do we shift that center as we come towards a close, so that all these different people get to be at the center? Whoever of you would like to respond to that.
That's a very complicated question. I think it has sort of picking up from where Christo was talking about. I think there are multiple levels at which you shift or change happens. There is the ideological level. And part of that ideological level, in our own case, has been this, sort of, to use a very simple term, colonial mentality, in which we always assume the best comes from elsewhere, comes from outside, is external to us. And this ranges from entertainment to measures of beauty, to political culture, economic orientations, and so on and so forth. So there is an ideological dimension that we constantly have to deal with and fight against. And then there are, of course, structural forces that, again, we have to deal with. Those structural forces include, what we, the ways our economic histories, structures have been put in place. Christo talked about, and from the slave trade era, the role we've played as a supplier of raw materials, but also as a supplier of huge resources in terms of human beings. The slave trade was a huge transfer of human capital from the continent. And when people talk about debt for Africa, who owes who? The Africans who were enslaved in the Americas spent 400 years, 250 in the United States and so on, without getting paid a penny. And that's a huge debt that the West owes to peoples of African descent, and of course, by extension to Africa. So those structural forces in terms of our integration into the world economy are things we have to look at. Let me just conclude by making one simple point. A moment like COVID-19 offers a historic opportunity for the continent. It's only during moments of global crisis that you see shifts in global hegemonies. For example, in the last 200 years, there have been three sort of eras of globalization. The first one from the late 19th century to about 1914. During that period, which was also characterized by a major crisis from 1870 to the 1890s, part of it also induced by a pandemic. That's when you started seeing shifts from Britain as the first industrial power to Germany and so on and so forth. But that global shift led to the new imperialism that led to the colonization of African parts of Asia. So we paid a huge price during that moment. The second moment of globalization was after the Second World War, with the rise of the new superpowers, the rise of multinationals in a certain form, and rise of the incorporation of the global South, or the third world in those days, into the global economy in a very different way from before, because of independence, decolonization struggle, and so on and so forth. That shift led to decolonization. The question we have to ask ourselves, is the shift taking place in global order, the collapse of the Western world, and certainly the United States as the global leader, the rise of China, the emerging economies, and so on and so forth? What are the historic opportunities in that moment? The first global shift led to colonization. The second global shift led to decolonization. Can this global shift lead to development for Africa? That's the big question.
That's a great question to ask. And I'm going to ask each one of you if you want to say a very last word to send us off at the end of our amazing 2050 conference, where you have inspired us and you've laid out your lives of how you have taken us to being this big global power. What is that last word going to be? did that moment in 2020, did that moment change the world as we know it? Professor Chelwa, what is your last word for us?
Well, I think, well, I don't know. I mean, I hope this is an answer to your question, but I think to add on to this discussion about how can we recenter sort of people, how can we recenter Africans, I think it's important to begin to take ourselves seriously. I mean, as Africans, I think it's important, for example, for our policymakers, start taking Africans seriously, African thought seriously, African intellectuals seriously, African civil society seriously, the African man and woman on the street seriously. I think we need to start taking ourselves seriously, you know, and I think that's the only way we can, you know, get ourselves to be at, you know, to get ourselves at the table. We can only get to the table if we take ourselves seriously. So I'm hoping that by 2050, you know, things would have changed entirely. I'm hoping that by 2050, African intellectuals will be taken seriously. I'm hoping that by 2050, African man and woman on the street will be taken seriously. By 2050, we will take ourselves seriously. I think that's what we need to start doing. We are not doing enough of that as it is. That's my sort of my last word.
Let's take ourselves seriously.
Mm-hmm.
Crystal?
And that's hard to come because I think Reeve stole my point. All the way from South Africa as he sips his cup of tea. But I think it's reclaiming our institutions, reclaiming our African Union, which is over 70% funded by external funders. What does that mean in terms of whose priorities are they really working on? Our own governments, our own regional bodies, our own, you know, anything right down to the local level, or the committees that work on the public hospitals. It's reclaiming our own institutions because they're ours and not giving room for anyone else to come in and tell us what to do, and tell us how to think and what to think about. I think it's taking ourselves seriously and at the same time taking power over our own institutions because they're ours.
Okay, so use this moment to really think about how we can change, take ourselves seriously, like seriously, every bit of it. And then just thinking about, again, how do we do that by taking all our resources, taking everything we have so that we move forward into a better future. I really want to thank all of you.
I just want to add a small bit. I think now that everybody's so busy with COVID in their own corners, this is a perfect time when they're not looking at us to just take our own stuff back.
Yes.
Start a revolution.
Yes.
Start our revolution, and we can start it now. 2050 does look like it's really far off, but we can honestly and sincerely change this continent, change our countries, change the world just by starting to do this ourselves, not relying on other people to get us there. I really want to thank every one of you very, very sincerely for your time, for your thoughts, for the ideas that you've just started. You don't know what kind of revolution you have started in the minds of those of us who have heard you. I want to thank all the participants, people who've put in questions, people who've made comments or who have just been present. Once again, I want to thank Ado for all the great posters that have really inspired our thinking throughout this series. And of course, as I return the conversation to Asita, I want to thank The Elephant, IFRA Nairobi, and Alliance Francaise for making these 4 cafes possible. And we look forward to continuing to have conversations in this season so that we make this season a season that we remember as a time when we entered into a new world, a new Africa, and certainly when we became new people. Thank you very much, everybody.